He didn't drop bombs, he didn't fight battles, but under his rule 10 million Congolese died, beaten, starved, mutilated. Children had their hands cut off to count bullets, villages were burned for missing rubber quotas, all for ivory, for rubber, for profit. This is not history forgotten. This is history buried alive by King Leopold II of Belgium. He was born in a palace, but he craved more than a throne. Leopold II of Belgium entered the world in 1835, the son of King Leopold I, the first monarch of the young Belgian kingdom. From childhood, he felt overshadowed by larger empires, Britain, France, the Netherlands. Belgium was small, landlocked, and largely insignificant in global affairs. That fact burned inside him like a slow fever. Where other boys played with toy soldiers, Leopold read colonial reports. While his tutors recited royal virtues, he studied maps of Africa, Asia, and the Americas, obsessed with the scars that empires left behind, not to heal them, but to carve new ones in his own name. Even as Crown Prince, Leopold was blunt, cold, and calculating. He toured foreign colonies in his early 20s, Egypt, India, Java, not as a tourist, but as a student of exploitation. What made colonies profitable? How were the native populations controlled? What systems turned blood into gold? He found his answer: private domination disguised as public good. In Belgium, Leopold was seen as distant and unpopular. He lacked the charm of his father or the warmth expected of royalty. But he was tireless in one pursuit: expansion. Again and again he petitioned the Belgian parliament to support overseas conquests. Again and again they refused. Belgium had no appetite for imperialism, no navy, and no stomach for foreign wars. So he changed his strategy. If Belgium wouldn't give him an empire, he would build one for himself, in secret. He began funding expeditions not as king, but as a private citizen. He created charitable organizations that claimed to oppose slavery in Africa. He formed geographic and philanthropic societies with names like the International African Association and the Committee for Studies of the Upper Congo. These weren't humanitarian missions, they were fronts. What he wanted was territory. What he offered was lies. To the outside world, Leopold positioned himself as a benevolent monarch. He told European leaders he wanted to civilize Africa, bring Christianity to the dark continent, and protect natives from Arab slave traders. He used the language of compassion, while planning conquest with terrifying precision. At the 1885 Berlin Conference, where European powers divided Africa among themselves like slices of cake, Leopold pulled off one of the greatest cons in imperial history. While others took colonies in the name of their nations, Leopold claimed a vast swath of Central Africa, 2.3 million square kilometres, not for Belgium, but for himself. It would be called the Congo Free State. He promised it would be free of slavery, free of cruelty, free of war. He promised wrong. Behind every word of idealism lay contracts forged in coercion, and behind every speech about humanity, a ledger marked in blood. He had sold the world a lie, and they bought it, cheaply. The Congo Free State became Leopold's private possession. Not a colony, not a nation, but property. He never stepped foot in it, but he owned every tree, every river, every life inside its borders, and he began to drain it, slowly, brutally, as if it were a carcass, not a country. At first, the world applauded him. In European capitals, statues were erected in his honour. The press praised his commitment to anti-slavery. Missionaries believed they were part of a divine plan. No one saw the whips, no one heard the screams, not yet. He was a king who smiled with a crown on his head and claws beneath his gloves. And the stage was set for one of the most horrifying crimes in modern history, not driven by rage, not by war, but by the cold arithmetic of profit. Rubber prices were rising, the world demanded more, and Leopold was ready to answer, with blood. Leopold did not march into the Congo with armies. He crept in with contracts. He understood that in the eyes of Europe, war was expensive, but charity was sacred. So he dressed conquest in the robes of compassion. He claimed he was not a colonizer, but a guardian of Africa, that he would protect the Congolese from the Arab slave trade, that he would bring schools, medicine, and God. He founded what he called the International African Association, a humanitarian group. On paper, its emblem bore a star of hope. Its mission was to suppress slavery and bring civilization. At conferences in Paris, Brussels, and Berlin, He gave eloquent speeches about dignity and Christian brotherhood. But on the ground, in the forests of Central Africa, a very different story was unfolding. Leopold's men, led by explorer Henry Morton Stanley, began signing treaties with local chiefs, or rather tricking them. These treaties were often written in languages the chiefs didn't understand, some were signed under threat, others under false promises of friendship. Most chiefs believed they were agreeing to mutual alliances. In truth, they were surrendering land, people, and sovereignty. By 1884, Leopold had collected enough of these fraudulent papers to present a case to the global powers that he owned the Congo. At the Berlin Conference of 1884-85, European nations gathered to carve Africa into colonial blocks, without a single African at the table. Leopold argued that his Congo Free State would be different. It would not be a colony. It would be a free land, governed not by a nation, but by an association of humanitarians. He even promised to allow free trade and scientific exploration for all nations. They believed him. With no army, no national flag, no political mandate, he was handed a territory 7 times the size of Belgium. Privately, Leopold rejoiced. In letters to his agents, he wrote not of peace, but of plunder. He gave instructions to extract rubber, ivory, and minerals at maximum efficiency. He was not interested in civilization, only in quotas. To the world, he built a myth. He commissioned paintings of white men helping African children. He published reports about clinics and schools that barely existed. He named his capital Boma and sent carefully staged photographs to Europe. He installed a bureaucratic system that looked like a government but functioned like a plantation. He created fake committees, fake budgets, even fake anti-slavery organizations that praised his efforts, funded directly by him. Meanwhile, a new system of labor was forming. Villages were ordered to collect wild rubber from vines deep in the jungle. Each man was given a monthly quota. Failure meant punishment, not just for the man, but for his family, his children, his entire village. Women and children were taken as hostages to enforce compliance. Fathers worked under the sun, bleeding from thorn-covered vines, knowing their daughters were held in chains until they returned with enough rubber. Those who resisted were whipped with chicots, hippo-hide whips that flayed the skin and exposed bone after 10 lashes. It wasn't colonization. It was a prison without bars. Leopold created the Force Publique, a brutal colonial army made up of Belgian officers and African conscripts. Their mission was simple: enforce quotas, crush rebellion, and instill fear. Each soldier was given bullets and told to return with proof they had not wasted ammunition. The proof? Severed hands. If a bullet was fired, a hand had to be shown. If there was no enemy, they took hands from civilians, sometimes from corpses, sometimes from the living. In Europe, few knew what was really happening. Leopold's propaganda machine worked tirelessly. Any dissent, missionaries, travellers, reporters, was silenced, letters intercepted, warnings ignored, and yet the numbers could not lie. Rubber exports soared, Leopold's wealth multiplied, his monuments grew taller. But in Congo, villages were disappearing. Rivers turned red. Forests echoed with silence, all under the name of freedom. The Congo Free State was not free. It was not a state. It was a lie with borders, and one man at its centre. Not a king, but a merchant of death, counting ivory and lives with equal detachment. The world had handed him a kingdom in good faith. He would return it soaked in blood. In the late 19th century, the world discovered a new hunger: rubber. It was the age of industry: bicycles, automobiles, electric wires. Rubber was gold in liquid form, and the jungles of Congo were full of it. But harvesting wild rubber was no easy task. Vines had to be found deep in the rainforest. The sap had to be extracted drop by drop, smeared onto skin, and painfully peeled off once dried. It took days, it tore flesh, and it was never enough. So Leopold created a system not of labour, but of terror. Villages were assigned quotas. Each man had to bring a fixed amount of rubber within a deadline. There were no tools, no pay, no rest days, only fear. To enforce the quotas, Leopold's agents took hostages, usually women and children. Entire families were held in chains, locked inside bamboo cages, often starved until the men returned with their share. If they failed, the punishment was swift. Whippings, burned homes, amputated limbs, public executions. Failure was not an option. Mercy was not a concept. The force publique, Leopold's private army, became the whip hand of his empire. Dressed in crisp uniforms, they carried rifles and quotas of their own. Their orders: deliver rubber, suppress rebellion, account for every bullet. That's when the hands began to pile up. To prove they hadn't wasted ammunition, soldiers were required to return a severed left hand for every bullet fired. It didn't matter who the hand belonged to, rebel or civilian, man or child. Some soldiers, desperate to meet their own quotas, killed innocent people. Others, more disturbingly, simply cut off the hands of the living to save bullets. Hands became a form of currency, a grotesque unit of proof. They were dried, counted, and stored like ledgers of pain. Missionaries began to report seeing baskets of hands brought to posts as tribute. One noted a soldier presenting 13 hands in a day. Another saw a child whose hand had been taken while his mother was whipped to death. One village chief, accused of rebellion, had every adult male's hand cut off as punishment. Then their wives were raped, their huts set ablaze, and the survivors were forced to keep working, one-handed. But the violence was not random, it was policy. Leopold's agents were paid based on rubber output. Villages that produced more were rewarded with reduced quotas or with the return of their hostages. Villages that failed were extinguished. Rebellion flared in places. Small groups of men armed with sticks or hunting spears tried to resist. Some succeeded briefly at ambushing patrols, hiding families deeper in the jungle. But retaliation was monstrous. Whole districts were burned to the ground. Survivors were lined up and shot. Infants thrown into rivers. Dogs unleashed on women. This wasn't colonialism. This was extraction through annihilation. By 1890, Leopold's regime was exporting more than 8 tons of rubber annually. Within a decade, that number had grown to over 6,000. The profit was astronomical. But the cost? Millions. It's estimated that up to 10 million Congolese died during Leopold's rule, through murder, starvation, disease, forced labour and despair. Entire tribes disappeared, languages vanished, traditions lost in spook and blood. Some missionaries tried to resist. They took photographs, collected testimonies, sent letters to Europe. One famous image showed a man named Nsala staring at the severed hand and foot of his 5-year-old daughter, punished because he hadn't met his rubber quota. That photo shocked the world. But for every image captured, thousands more remained unseen, because the dead in Congo did not get tombstones. They became profit margins. Back in Belgium, Leopold bathed in glory. He used the wealth from Congo to build grand boulevards, royal palaces, monuments to himself. He commissioned art, donated to charities, funded museums, all while denying every allegation. He claimed the reports were lies, that missionaries were exaggerating, that rebels were sabotaging progress, but the vines knew the truth. The forests had become graveyards, the trees were slick with red, and every shipment of rubber that left the port of Matadi was paid for, not in coins, but in screams. In most wars, bodies are counted. In Leopold's Congo, it was hands. The system was horrifying in its simplicity. The force publique was issued bullets, and for each bullet used, officers had to show proof it was not wasted. That proof? The severed left hand of a victim, not an official policy according to Leopold. But it was practiced widely, systematically, mandated in practice, if not on paper. If a soldier used a bullet, he had to account for it. And hands became that currency of death. In a regime obsessed with quotas, rubber, ivory, labour, even violence had its own bureaucratic measures. The logic was chilling. No hand, no bullet. No bullet, no salary. No salary, no survival. At first, soldiers brought back hands from the corpses of rebels. But soon it became easier and faster to take them from the living. Children, farmers, elderly women, anyone encountered in the forest could become a number in this grotesque accounting. Some men fired bullets into the air, then hacked off hands from the innocents. Others killed one person and took multiple hands from others to match the count. In many cases, they cut off hands before shooting, a grotesque inversion of cause and effect. It wasn't just soldiers. Village chiefs, forced into service under Leopold's rule, were often commanded to collect hands from their own people. One Congolese man later testified that he and his neighbours were ordered to bring severed hands in baskets or face death themselves. These weren't isolated atrocities. They were part of the quota system. Some European officers even kept collections, dried hands, shrunken fingers, as trophies. Others had native guards perform mass amputations as punishment or performance. The horror bled into everyday life. Children grew up with one hand, mothers buried sons they couldn't even recognize. Entire villages were marked by what was missing: arms, eyes, fathers. Photographs taken by missionaries began to emerge. A boy named Akana, arms gone at the elbow. A mother staring into a basket holding her daughter's tiny hand. A dozen men with stumps where fingers had been. These images spoke louder than any speech, and for the first time Europe began to look, but Leopold denied everything. He called the photos fake, the stories exaggerations. He accused missionaries of spreading rebellion. He said his rule was bringing roads, hospitals, and law. He smiled for the camera. He never once visited the rubber fields. He never once held the hand of a dying child. But he demanded they be counted. And for over 2 decades the baskets kept filling, one by one, hand by hand, in silence. In the Congo Free State, terror wasn't a side effect, it was the blueprint. The regime Leopold had created did not rely on understanding, diplomacy, or consent. It was a system built entirely on dominations, not just of bodies but of minds. Fear became the fuel and cruelty the machinery. There were no courts, no appeals, no protections, there was only the chicotte. A whip carved from hippopotamus hide dried until it was stiff as iron. 5 lashes could break the skin. 10 would tear it to the bone. 100 could kill. It was used publicly, always publicly. Punishment had to be seen. The message had to spread. Fathers were whipped in front of their children. Wives were forced to watch their husbands bleed into the earth. Rebels were lashed until they couldn't stand, then forced back into the jungle to meet their rubber quotas, with blood still dripping down their legs. Sometimes the whipping didn't end in death. Sometimes it ended in branding, with hot irons pressed to flesh as a warning. Sometimes it ended in fire. Villages that refused to meet demands were burned to ash, thatched roofs ignited like paper. Children were herded into huts and locked inside, entire communities gone in a night to make an example of disobedience. Soldiers would often force survivors to collect rubber in the ruins of their own homes. It was not a random spree of violence. It was mathematical. Fear was rationed. Violence was distributed. A balance was maintained, just enough terror to keep people compliant, not so much as to spark mass rebellion. An equilibrium of evil. Hostage-taking became routine. For every adult man in the village, at least one wife, daughter, or mother would be imprisoned. These hostages were held in stockades. Sometimes they were starved, sometimes raped, sometimes they were never returned, even when quotas were met. They were bargaining chips in a business contract no one had agreed to, and for those who tried to escape, for those who ran into the jungle or took up spears against the force publique, there was only one outcome: annihilation. Rebel villages were surrounded at night, elders executed, crops burned, wells poisoned, infants dashed against trees. Leopold called this pacification. In some cases, groups of workers simply vanished. No records, no graves, just silence where once there was language, music, dance, a whole culture swallowed by the machine. Psychological warfare was just as cruel. Congolese children were forced to serve as porters, often too small to carry the loads. Some were used as human shields in raids. Others were raised within the force publique, brainwashed to turn against their own people. Boys were taught that bullets were gods and whips were justice. In time, the violence became self-sustaining. Local chiefs, desperate to protect their own villages, began enforcing Leopold's laws themselves. They demanded rubber from their own people. They turned in rebels. They ordered amputations, not for belief, but for survival. The system had infected them. It was no longer Leopold's terror. It had become everyone's. And that was the genius of it. He didn't need to oversee every village. He didn't need to swing the whip himself. He built a machine of fear that ran on autopilot, oiled by blood, maintained by silence. From his palace in Brussels, he read glowing reports about increased production, lower resistance, higher yields. The numbers pleased him. He never asked what they meant. But every figure in his ledger was written in shadow. Behind it, a burned hut, a missing child, a handless leprera crawling through vines. Terror wasn't the price of the system. It was the system. As the rubber flowed out of Congo, the wealth flowed into Belgium. Steamships loaded with barrels of latex and bundles of ivory left the ports of Boma and Matadi under the scorching African sun. By the time they reached Antwerp, they had transformed, not just in content, but in meaning. Rubber became revenue, ivory became elegance, blood became gold, and Leopold, a monarch once dismissed as unremarkable, became a titan. He never set foot in Congo, never saw the vines, never heard the screams, yet the profits from the Congo Free State were his alone, not Belgium's, not the state's, his. Estimates vary, but historians agree. Leopold personally siphoned the modern equivalent of over $1 billion from the Congo, wealth acquired without taxes, without oversight, and without morality. What did he do with it? He built. He commissioned grand boulevards in Brussels, elegant streets lined with imported stone and bronze statues. He funded the Royal Museum for Central Africa, filled with relics looted from Congolese villages. He erected monuments to himself, towering effigies that praised his civilizing mission. He built palaces, not just for royalty but for illusion. Facades of greatness, rising on the bones of millions. The Palace of the Colonies in Tervuren, with its manicured gardens and massive halls, stood as the centerpiece. It was meant to celebrate his triumph in Africa, a museum of conquest disguised as culture. Guests strolled through exhibits featuring taxidermied animals, tribal masks, spears, and photographs, staged portraits of smiling Africans, supposedly grateful for European rule. None of the pictures showed amputated children. None mentioned the villages that had been razed. It was a kingdom of violence, polished and presentable. Meanwhile, in Congo, silence meant something else, the absence of life. By the early 1900s, the human cost was undeniable. The Congolese population had fallen from an estimated 20 million to 10 million. Entire regions were depopulated. Some tribes lost over 80% of their people. Others disappeared entirely. Languages, songs, rituals erased, with no trace but smoke. Most died not from bullets, but from exhaustion, disease, starvation and despair. Men collapsed in the jungle from overwork. Children succumbed to smallpox, sleeping sickness and dysentery. Women stopped bearing children out of fear, malnutrition or trauma. Suicides rose. Families disappeared overnight. It was not just death, and it was unravelling. Communities that once thrived on rivers and trade routes became ghost settlements. Oral traditions were broken. Elders, who had passed down history for generations, died without students to remember them. Spiritual leaders fled into the forest or were killed for resisting modernization. Even the environment suffered. In the rush for rubber, forests were stripped bare, vines were cut and drained until they died. Animal populations declined, farmlands were abandoned or burned, famine followed, and still the rubber quotas rose. Leopold's administration rewarded agents who brought in the highest yields. One district commissioner was praised for tripling his region's output, though his territory had lost half its people. He was promoted. The math didn't care about morality. More rubber meant more reward. Less people meant less witnesses. In Belgium, the king's popularity soared, and for a time. He presented himself as a humanitarian, a builder of empire, a father of progress. He attended galas, commissioned paintings, and funded churches. He donated to hospitals, even as he crushed entire communities overseas. Few questioned him, even fewer challenged him. Those who tried, missionaries, early reporters, whistleblowers, were dismissed as radicals or liars. Their warnings were buried under waves of praise and polished reports. But cracks began to show, the numbers stopped adding up, eyewitnesses escaped, photos leaked. And the name Congo Free State began to mean something else. Murder, mutilation, madness. Yet for Leopold it didn't matter. He had already built his legacy, in stone and marble. And if it stood on a foundation of corpses, he simply smiled and built higher. For nearly 2 decades, Leopold's machine of terror ran unchecked. But in the shadows, where silence reigned and severed hands dried in baskets, a few voices began to rise. They were not soldiers. They were not kings. They were witnesses. Among the first was George Washington Williams, an African-American journalist and former soldier. In 1890, he travelled to the Congo believing Leopold's promise, a humanitarian mission, a land freed from slavery. What he found horrified him. He saw hostages taken, villages destroyed, people chained. And when he returned to Europe, he wrote an open letter to King Leopold, accusing him of crimes against humanity. It was one of the first times the world heard the phrase, but Europe didn't listen. Williams died a year later, sick and poor, his warnings buried with him. Then came the missionaries. Men like William Shepherd and John Harris, stationed deep in the Congo, began documenting what they saw. Shepherd, a black Presbyterian missionary from the United States, risked his life photographing massacres, burned villages, and piles of severed hands. Harris sent his report straight to Britain, writing in desperation, "Dear Sirs, I am now going to go out and try to buy a hand. If such a thing can be bought, I will send it to you." These weren't exaggerations, they were evidence, but the most effective resistance came not from Congo, but from within Europe itself. A British shipping clerk named E.D. Morel, working in Liverpool, noticed something strange. Every ship leaving Belgium for the Congo carried guns, chains, ammunition, not medicine or supplies. Every ship returning carried rubber and ivory but no signs of trade. There was no commerce, only extraction, only slavery. Morel quit his job and began a movement. He launched newspapers, gave speeches, wrote reports. He exposed the truth. The Congo Free State was a corporate colony of terror, not a benevolent mission. He called it a crime unparalleled in the history of Africa. Alongside him was Roger Casement, a British consul who travelled to the Congo to investigate. What he found became the Casement Report of 1904, a damning, detailed account of murders, mutilations, rape and forced labour. The report shook Europe. For the first time, governments could not look away. The evidence was too detailed, the photos too brutal, the testimonies too numerous. Still, Leopold fought back. He launched an international propaganda campaign, spending millions to polish his image. He hired ghostwriters to praise his work. He funded Catholic missions to speak in his defence. He threatened reporters. He censored Belgian newspapers. He called the Casement Report a fraud. But the tide was turning. Ordinary citizens, teachers, priests, factory workers, began attending lectures on the Congo. Newspapers across Britain, France and America ran images of mutilated children. Political cartoons depicted Leopold as a vampire, draining Africa dry. The Congo Reform Association was born, the first major international human rights campaign in modern history. Petitions flooded parliaments, public pressure mounted, and in Belgium Leopold began to sweat. He denied, deflected, delayed. But even he couldn't stop what was coming. Under international outrage and facing mounting scrutiny, Leopold was forced to give up his personal rule. In 1908, he handed the Congo over to the Belgian government, not out of remorse, but as damage control. He was never tried, never convicted, never punished. But he had been unmasked. What he called civilization, the world now saw for what it was: slavery in disguise, murder in uniform, greed in royal robes. The whistleblowers had spoken, and the marble of Leopold's empire began to crack. Leopold II ruled over Congo for 23 years. 23 years of silence, of severed hands, of children buried without names. And when the truth finally reached Europe, the walls he had built with gold and deceit began to tremble. In 1908, under unbearable pressure from Britain, activists, missionaries, and even Belgian citizens, Leopold was forced to surrender the Congo Free State. He did not admit guilt. He did not apologize. Instead, he negotiated the handover as if it were a business transaction. The Congo would now be ruled by the Belgian parliament, becoming a colony of the state rather than the personal property of the king. And in return, Leopold demanded compensation. He was paid for giving up the colony. He received millions of francs, and the Belgian government agreed to assume his debts, many of which had funded his atrocities. There would be no court, no testimony, no justice. Because Leopold had never technically broken any laws. The horror he unleashed had occurred outside Belgium, and within a legal grey zone he had engineered. There was no legal framework to prosecute him, no international court, no political will, and so he remained free, but not untouched. By now the world had seen the photos, the mutilated children, the burned villages, the baskets of hands. Newspapers depicted him as a butcher in royal robes. Statues of him were defaced in protest, and at home the illusion began to crumble. In Belgium, many once praised him as a modernizer and builder of cities, but as word of the atrocities spread, public sentiment shifted. Priests stopped mentioning him in sermons. Artists withdrew their commissions. Historians began to hesitate. And Leopold, once arrogant and untouchable, grew increasingly paranoid. He withdrew from public life, stopped appearing in parades, spent his final months surrounded by lawyers and silence. He obsessed over his image, ordering the destruction of thousands of pages of personal records, trying to erase the paper trail of what had been done in his name. But memory is not so easily burned. On December 17, 1909, Leopold II died of natural causes in his palace at Laeken. He was 74. He died in luxury. He died of Savaud without ever seeing the Congo. But fate, Anti, and history had a small revenge waiting. At his funeral procession through the streets of Brussels, the crowds did not cheer. They did not cry. They did not bow. Instead, they turned their backs. Tens of thousands of Belgians stood along the royal route, facing away from the coffin in silent protest. It was a gesture more cutting than words, more lasting than riots. A king buried under silence, not mourning, but disgust. He was laid to rest in the royal crypt at the Church of Our Lady of Laeken. A grand tomb, cold and ornate, standing atop bones, both his and the ones he never met. No war crimes tribunal ever called his name. No international body ever condemned him. No reparations were made to the Congo, but history remembered, and not with honour. For decades after his death, Belgium tried to clean his legacy. Schoolbooks softened his image. Statues were erected to glorify his vision. Museums told of adventure, not annihilation. But the truth refused to stay buried. Survivors whispered to grandchildren. Photos survived fire. Books were written. The voices Leopold tried to silence endured. And today, his name lives on. Not in bronze, not in marble, but in shame. He could not be tried, but he could be judged. After Leopold's death in 1909, Belgium faced a choice. It could confront the truth, or bury it, beneath marble, medals, and national pride. It chose silence. For most of the 20th century, the atrocities of the Congo Free State were erased from schoolbooks, ignored in museums, and excluded from national memory. History classes told of Leopold as a builder king, the man who gave Belgium parks, railways, museums. Children memorized his architecture, not his amputations. In official portraits he appeared regal, stern, visionary. No chicotte, no severed hands, no 10 million dead. The Congo, meanwhile, was treated as a footnote, a wild land civilized by Belgian hands. Even after it became a formal colony of Belgium, its people remained second class, its suffering unspoken. There were no monuments for the victims, only for the king who caused them. Brussels, Antwerp, Ghent, cities across Belgium proudly displayed statues of Leopold II. He stood on horseback. He stood with maps. He stood always above. Below him, engraved in stone, were words like bringer of civilization, defender of Africa, benefactor of the Congo. But beneath those stones the truth simmered. In Congo, elders remembered. In whispered prayers, in lullabies laced with grief, they passed down stories of burned villages, chained mothers, disappeared sons. The trauma became ancestral mandanda, a silence woven into the day of a nation. As Congo gained independence in 1960, it faced its own struggles, dictatorships, civil wars, resource exploitation. But the ghost of Leopold never left. His legacy echoed in the dysfunction he had engineered, a broken system built on fear, still bleeding decades after his last ship had sailed. Meanwhile, in Europe, a slow awakening began. In the 90s, historians and activists began re-examining colonial legacies. Books like King Leopold's Ghost by Adam Hochschild peeled back the sanitized narratives. Photos long buried in archives resurfaced. Testimonies of missionaries were reread with horror. And a new generation asked, how did we forget? The answer, we were taught to. But memory has a way of returning, especially when it is suppressed. In the 2000s, debates ignited across Belgium. Should the statues of Leopold remain? Should children learn the full history? Should the king's name be removed from streets, schools, and parks? Resistance was fierce. Some called it erasing heritage. Others called it restoring truth. And then, in 2020, the world changed. After the murder of George Floyd in the United States, global protests erupted against racism and colonial violence. In Belgium, young protesters gathered around Leopold's statues not to honour them, but to denounce them. They sprayed red paint across his face. They placed placards in the hands he once severed. They wrote on the pedestal, "I can't breathe, neither could they." In Antwerp, one statue was removed after being set on fire. In Ghent, another was defaced with the word genocide. In Brussels, schoolchildren staged sit-ins demanding truth in education. It was no longer about the past, it was about memory as justice. The Belgian monarchy issued a statement in 2020 acknowledging the painful colonial past. But it stopped short of apologising. No reparations have been made, no formal charges brought, ever, and many statues still stand, but cracks have formed, in stone, in silence, in national myths, and in Congo some now speak louder. Artists repaint the past. Poets write of rubber soaked in blood. Children learn the names of ancestors, not as victims, but as survivors. The memory of Leopold II, once carved in marble, now floats in the air, fragile, uncomfortable, unignorable, because you can tear down a statue, but you cannot unbury 10 million graves. Leopold II died a king. He was never arrested, never exiled, never condemned in court. He left behind no confession, no final words, no sign of regret. And yet, his name is remembered more for the pain he caused than the palaces he built. 10 million. That's not a statistic. That's a silence so large it echoes across generations. No monument can carry it. No textbook can hold it fully. No apology, however late, can undo what was done. But it must still be told, because Leopold's story is not only about the past, it's about the stories we choose to protect and the ones we bury. It's about how power wears masks, of progress, of charity, of civilization. It's about how evil doesn't always scream. Sometimes it smiles and signs treaties. It's about how an entire system can operate with perfect paperwork and no humanity, with quotas met and lives forgotten. And most of all, it's about how history is written by those who survive, but also often edited by those who win. We like to believe that genocide happens with gas chambers, or in the midst of war. But in Congo, it happened in the quiet of the jungle, in the bookkeeping of rubber, in the polished halls of a European palace. This was not rage, it was routine. As the narrator, I am not here to accuse modern Belgium. I am not Congolese. I was not there. But I am here to remember, and I ask you to do the same. Because if we forget, then what stops it from happening again? Not with whips and rubber vines, but in factories, in sweatshops, in the silent corners of economies that reward profit over people. There is a part of Leopold in every system that values products more than lives. His ghost doesn't haunt Congo, it haunts us. When we turn our faces away, when we accept monuments but reject memory, when we believe that wealth can be separated from the wounds it leaves behind. So I ask you, not as a historian, but as a fellow human being, what are we building today, and whose bones lie beneath it?